Vayigash is the name of the Torah portion for this week. Toward the end of the book of Genesis, we're reading the story of Joseph revealing himself ultimately to his brothers. After so many years of distance, Joseph knew that they were alive, but they had no idea that he had survived the ordeal after selling him as a slave to the passing merchants, pulling him out of the pit. Think of all the things that they did to him. They were ashamed of themselves. Worse, when he said, "I'm Joseph, your brother," they were terrified that he was going to wreak revenge upon them, justifiably so after everything that they did to him. They rightly believed that they deserved the worst possible punishment that Joseph could throw upon them, throwing them in the dungeon, throwing them as captives, doing what they did to him, he would do to them. Maybe worse, maybe he'd kill them. While they were shaking in the boots, this is what Joseph says to his brothers. "God sent me ahead of you to preserve you for a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt." In these two sentences, Joseph sums up his feelings towards his brothers. Not only does he not hold a grudge against them for stripping him of his precious coat that his father had given him, dipping it in blood, throwing it at the father, while the father believed that Joseph was dead for all of these years, going down to hell, Sheol, in mourning for him, having been sold as a slave, being thrown into the dungeons of Egypt. After all of the terrible things that happened to Joseph, he does not only not hold a grudge against them for stripping him of everything that he had, his family, his freedom, all else, but he declares that everything was a part of God's plan. We rarely have a choice in what happens to us. Life happens, but we always have a choice in the way that we respond to what occurs. Some of us will prefer to harbor feelings of anger and resentment and coddle them until they become a terrible malignancy that grows inside of us every day exponentially, until it consumes us and we become a monster. Or worse, it kills us. Others choose the path of forgiveness, because that is not only a gift to themselves, but it is a gift to the other as well. A religious person understands that our choices can also not only be inner-directed, but God-directed. That everything that happens to us can be made purposeful if we understand that God is an actor behind the curtain that ultimately controls everything. Gam ze l'tova, that everything can be for the best, but we have to be able to have eyes that see the good that adheres in everything, or at least the potential good that adheres in everything. You and I, we write the narrative of our own lives. In our book of life, we count the favors that God has done for us, the many favors that we've been granted in our life, or we rail against God for our personal failures, or the ways that we feel that others have mistreated us, or life has let us down. Joseph, however, sees his life in terms of gratitude. And can you imagine if all of the things that happened to Joseph happened to you? How would you feel? God has given Joseph the gift, not the pain and the punishment, but the gift of coming to Egypt, of saving his life, and preserving the life of all the Egyptians, and ultimately preserving the life of his family as well, because were it not for Joseph being now vizier, second only to Pharaoh, his family would starve to death in the land of Israel. God has made Joseph indispensable to Pharaoh, and now he greets his brothers with open arms and tears of love. There is a book that is called Kitzur Shnei Luchot Habrit, written by Rabbi Epstein. And in that book, he considers the idea of forgiveness in the following way. If your neighbor wronged you, forgive him at once, because it says in the Torah, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, you should love your neighbor as yourself. if you take those words to be true, if you love your neighbor as yourself and you love yourself, then you have to love your neighbor, even if your neighbor sometimes is unlovable. And then he goes on to say, would you vengefully punish your one hand for having hurt the other? Since we're all tethered together, we're all interconnected. What happens to you happens to him, happens to her, happens to me. That everything cascades outward like ripples in a pond. We're all interconnected. Forgiveness becomes so integral to life. It's critical that we forgive ourselves, that we, more importantly, forgive others as well. What ultimately will be written in your book of life? How you harbored the pain and the tragedies that you've endured? Or how you've celebrated the goodness, the greatness, and the grandeur that life has granted you? Shabbat Shalom.